wasting money on sewing supplies you'll never use. Listen, using the right tools can make or break your corset stays and bodies, but that doesn't mean you have to shell out the big bucks. So since I just finished my umpteenth pair of stays and it's fresh in my mind, let's raid my sewing toolbox and rank the good, the bad, and the stupid. Because y'all, in the 17 or 18 years I've been making corsets, I've made all the mistakes, and you shouldn't have to. So where will your favorite tool rank on my list? Tiers. At the top of the list, the cream of the crop is Get It. These are the items that you will use repeatedly for corsetry and regular sewing alike. They are multitaskers, economical to purchase, and will serve you well in your corset making endeavors. Next on our list is your third rodeo. These are tools you will want to work your way up to. Things that you will need, but not necessarily right at the beginning. Then we've got, if you've got the moolah. These tools are fancy and pricey, and they're good to have, but by no means are they necessary. Next is niche please. These are tools that are really great, but only in specific cases. And finally, in the place of shame, the things that you should never buy and never even contemplate is nope. You know, I've only ever played Exploding Kitten once and it was traumatizing, but I will never stop loving the nope cards. Okay, so I've organized this into chapters so you can skip forward to what you need. Also, this is one person's opinion based on my personal skills and experience, so please keep that in mind. Also, this list is not exhaustive, and I'm not including anything super basic and obvious like needles and thread because, well, if you don't think you need to use needles and thread to make corsets, I can't help you. First on our list is synthetic whalebone. While it's made of plastic, synthetic whalebone is said to mimic the actual properties of baleen, which of course is what they historically used to bone corset stays and bodies. This is considered to be one of the more historically accurate materials. I've never actually used synthetic whalebone in my stays or bodies for one very specific reason. It cost my entire bank account. Not including shipping, a 50-meter roll of synthetic whalebone cost about 80 bucks. Now, I've never actually measured how much boning a pair of 17th century bodies actually takes, so this is an educated guess, but bodies on a figure like mine would probably take half that roll. Compare that to a bag of zip ties, which costs about $12 and also uses half a bag. That I know. I mean, the difference is obvious. I have some more period accurate concerned friends who swear by this stuff, but in the long run, this is not a necessary tool unless you got the moolah. Next is Frixion pens. Heat erasable pens are a game changer. Tailors chalk can be hard to erase, and we don't always work with washable fabrics when we're making corset stays and bodies, so this is a great tool to have. One note, they don't erase on everything, so make sure you test on a spare bit of your fashion fabric first before you scribble all over the whole thing. They're really great for everything but dark colored fabrics. I know that white heat erasable pens exist, but I've never been able to find any that actually work. So if you've got a brand that does show up on black fabric, please pop me the name in the comments. Handy Frixion pens, you're going in. Get it. Next on our list are sergers. Regular viewers of my channel will know this, but I serge pretty much everything. As someone with a professional theater and dance background, I learned as a basic strategy to serge all of your raw edges to protect against wear and tear. I saved up my money for years doing dance costume commissions to buy my serger, and I love it. For me, it was well worth the price because I do sew knits and I'm really hard on my clothing. Having that protection against fraying is a big thing for me, especially when making corset stays and bodies, because even the final make requires a lot of ripping out of seams and re-sewing seams to get the right fit, and it makes it infinitely easier. But sergers are very expensive. Unless you're buying secondhand, the decent quality ones start at a few $100s. I think my Janome, which is on the lower end of the middle of the range, cost me about $400 10 years ago. Not everyone has access to that kind of money or has a sewing business to offset the cost. You don't need a serger. If your sewing machine does a zigzag, that will help protect against fraying. Is it as good as a serger? No, but a zigzag is a sufficient tool for the job if you're just a casual sewer. Sergers are also finicky and require a lot more maintenance, and if you neglect that maintenance, you will suffer the consequences. That just happened to me this week. So if you have the money and do a lot of sewing, a serger is definitely a good investment, but only if you got the moolah. Next, we have Tailors curves. You'll see a lot of makers, particularly those that draft, using these babies. Tailors curves come in all shapes and materials, but they have one purpose: to draw the cleaves. Yeah, baby. In theory, the curve contains every basic curve you'll find on a human body. In practice, it's not that easy. Figuring out where to put the curve to achieve the correct angle isn't always obvious, and it takes a lot of trial and error. I've got about 4 of these in different materials and sizes, and I do admit they come in handy, but I wouldn't classify it as something that's good for beginners. I think you need to train your eye to the curves of the patterns first before you can utilize it correctly. So I'm gonna put this in your 3rd rodeo. Next, let's talk about steel boning. There are pluses and minuses to using steel in your corsets. Pluses: it's strong, supportive, and flexible. Cons: it's heavy and expensive. A corset with all metal boning is going to weigh way more than one that is partially steel or has no steel at all. However, there are some cases where you need to use steel and some cases where you do not. Here are my basic parameters. Don't use metal boning in stays or bodies. Generally, these garments are fully boned or half boned, and using steel for every one of those channels is going to get you something that weighs more than chainmail. It will not be comfortable, and it will be so expensive. If you're making a corset, in other words, a supportive garment created from, let's say, 1840 up through modern day, then you will want to consider using at least some steel. You'll 100% need straight steel bones sandwiching both sides of your lacing holes. Plastic isn't strong enough to support the waist reduction. I also suggest, especially if you're large in the chest area, to use at least 1 straight steel bone on either side of your busk in the front, or if your corset doesn't have a busk in the front, 3 straight steel bones in the center. Finally, any seams that are curved, think the bust seams or the side seams, you're gonna wanna use spiral steel. Spiral steel flexes in multiple directions and is really going to help you get the curves you want and keep you comfortable while doing it. From there, you can use supplemental steel boning if you wish, or zip ties, which is what I did in my witchy Victorian corset. And that thing is super supportive and super comfortable. So steel boning is going into niche, please, because it's only good in certain situations. Seam allowance curves. I saw a larger costumer using these years ago and immediately went and bought some for myself. They seemed like such a great idea, especially because I'm a proponent of cutting off your seam allowances on corsetry patterns to achieve maximum accuracy. But in practice, I always forget about them until after I've added all my seam allowances. Yeah, that's a personal problem. Do you need these tools? No. A seam gauge, which you probably already have, is sufficient to do the job. I personally would like to use my curves more because I find that my seam allowances tend to be a little less smooth than the actual pattern. But given that I keep forgetting to use them and still come out with some nice looking corset stays and bodies, I'll put this in if you got the moolah. Okay, now let's talk about the double tracing wheel. A double tracing wheel has 2 little spiking things on it instead of just 1 and is width adjustable. This is great if you're somebody who utilizes tracing paper a lot. If you're someone who doesn't like to cut your paper patterns and chooses to trace them out instead, I'd say this is probably a great tool for you because you can mark your seam line and your cutting line in one swoop. It's also potentially a cheaper option for folks who don't use seam allowances on their corset patterns but don't want to shell out for the seam allowance curves. But do you need this? No. And if you're not someone who likes to faff about with tracing paper, this tool probably isn't going to be very useful for you. Let's put it in niche, please. Next on our list is a clear ruler. A large quilting ruler with gridded lines is great. This is, I think, my #1 most used tool, and it's so good for adding straight seam allowances, redrawing grain lines, and a myriad of other things. Mine also has angled lines for cutting things on the bias. They price at about, I think, $25, but if you're patient, you can find a 50% off coupon and get it for half that. Even full price though, this thing is a workhorse for corsetry and all your sewing. This is going straight in. Get it! All right, next up is grommets. Let's talk about grommets. This is something I struggled with a lot when I was first starting out with corsetry. For corsetry purposes, we're looking at 2 different sizes of grommets. 0, which is equivalent to 3/16 of an inch, and 0, which is equivalent to 1/4 of an inch. Personally, I prefer the smaller size. They just look more delicate and aesthetic to me, although I have used both. Note that if you're making anything that reduces you significantly, I also recommend the 0 size, as more grommets equals more distribution of pressure, which will result in more comfort and less buckling. Now, the rule for these is if you're using steel boning, you need to be using grommets. Hand-worked eyelets will rip if you're exerting pressure like that, and that has happened to me. So steel boning equals metal grommets. And a note for historical costumers, metal grommets were invented in the 1830s. So if you're aiming to be historically accurate, anything 1830s or earlier is going to need to have hand-worked eyelets. If you don't care about HA, then use your metal grommets on stays if you want, but they're not necessary. I think folks might disagree with this, but I'm gonna put grommets in your 3rd rodeo. 1, because they require some expensive hardware, and 2, because if you're new to corsetry, you should really be starting with something simpler that doesn't require grommets, like Regency 18th century or history bounding stays. Even if that's not the era you eventually want to costume in. Those options are much more forgiving and much easier to fit for a novice. But that's another video. Oh. Next, we've got metal eyelets and a metal eyelet setter. These suckers are the reason this video exists. I own 2 of these things. I bought one, it didn't work, so I bought another one. It still didn't work. And that was not the first time I had attempted it. Let me tell you something, y'all. These eyelet setters are garbage. Why did nobody tell me this all those years ago when I was struggling? Because metal eyelets have no business in your corsetry makes. This does not equal this. Do you see the size difference? Metal eyelets are too small and too weak to go through all those layers and stay set in the fabric. They will not support you. They will continuously fall out of your fabric and cause pain and remorse. Nor do they take the place of hand-worked eyelets. That is a totally different monster. Hand-worked eyelets are meant to house lacing for stays and bodies. Metal eyelets are made for, I don't know what they're made for, but not for corsets. Don't buy the shit. Don't even look at it. Nope. Next, we've got the grommet banger thing. If you're using grommets, you need a grommet banger thing. Grommet setter? Grommet tool? What the heck do you call that thing? I don't know. I like grommet banger thing. The ultimate banger. But I digress. This is the thing you want to use to set in your grommets. It consists of a base, usually a little block of wood, and a pointy hammer thinger. You'll also want one of these guys, which are generally not sold with a kit. You don't want to use a regular hammer with this thing. Here's the catch with these. They're not cheap. I think they run about 25 bucks, and you need a different one for each different size of grommet. They also require some skill, so when you're first starting out, I do recommend buying extra grommets to practice on. I've made the mistake of not hammering them incorrectly, leaving split metal bits that have snagged both my dresses and the lacing. This is another reason why I suggest you start with something that doesn't require metal grommets. So like those, this is going in your 3rd rodeo. Next up is zip ties. Did you know that you could use zip ties as boning? I didn't for a very long time. This changed my life as a corset and stay maker. Before I knew this, I was using expensive steel for everything. While I've heard that they're not as good as synthetic whalebone, the price and availability is so much more accessible. And I use these in all of my corsets. Y'all, if you're not doing the zip tie thing, you're wasting money. This goes straight into get it. Next is lacing guide. This is a ruler that has, you guessed it, evenly spaced marks for your eyelets and grommets. I do have one of these, and every time I use it, I get people asking me where I got it from. It's quite handy. I like not having to think about it when I'm making my lacing marks, especially since I'm a historical costumer with a YouTube channel, so I make a ton of corsets. It saves a lot of time. But is it necessary? No. You can achieve the same effect using a gridded ruler. And even with this thing, I've never managed to make a completely even, straight set of lacing holes in my life. It's not a perfect solution. These cost about $16, not including shipping. So lacing guide, you're going in if you got the moolah. Also, if you're enjoying this video and want to help support this channel, please consider checking out my Ko-fi page. No donation is too small, and each dollar makes a huge difference in me being able to continue making sewing content. Thanks to everyone who has contributed so far. Y'all are my actual heroes. And if you don't got the moolah, I totally get it. Just by giving this video a thumbs up and maybe sticking around to the end helps support this channel and lets YouTube know I'm creating content that you actually want to watch. All right, next let's talk about fancy fashion fabric. If you're a beginner, you're not going to like what I have to say. And that's why it's important that I say it. You have no business using expensive fabrics in your first couple of corset stays and bodies. Why? Because the first couple you make are going to be complete rubbish. That's expected. Get it into your head now. My regular viewers are nodding along with this because I say it in every single corsetry video I make, and I'll continue to say it because it's the most important thing you'll ever learn about corsetry. Don't set yourself up for heartache and failure. Save your expensive fashion fabric for your third rodeo. You'll thank me later, partner. Rigiline boning is next. The benefit to Rigiline boning is that it is sewable. You can stitch over it with your sewing machine without breaking your needles. It's used a lot in formal wear, bridal gowns, prom gowns, that sort of thing, but this stuff is not suitable for real corsetry. It's just not strong enough. It'll give shape to your fabric, but it isn't enough to support you. The very first corset I made, which was a total disaster of course, the pattern actually called for this stuff, and that in itself is a crime. Because unless you're wearing a bra underneath, this ain't gonna do it. This is going in, nope. Next up is Fitting Buddy. This is a hot take, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree, but I stand fully behind this statement. If you are a fully able person, fitting buddies are always optional. Can they be helpful? Yes, especially in certain situations. 18th century sleeves, I'm looking at you. But it really upsets me when other creators look blatantly at the camera and are like, you can't do this without a fitting buddy. Y'all, I get so many comments from people, and yes, I read the comments, folks, and try to respond to at least your first one, saying they're too afraid to make the thing because they don't have someone to help them fit. You know what? I do it on every single make without a fitting buddy. And speaking about corsetry in particular, fitting buddies can actually be more of a hindrance than a help. See, every person wants to be helpful and will offer you advice regardless of whether or not they know what they're talking about. And they may think they know what they're talking about, even if they don't. So when fitting corset stays and bodies, a fitting buddy is only as good of a help as their particular experience allows. There are things you need to ask yourself before you take what they say to heart. Do they make corsets a lot? Do they make corsets only for themselves or for other people as well? Do they make things in the era that you're working in? If your fitting buddy's era is Edwardian and that's the only thing that they do, they may not understand the proper fit of the 1660s pair of bodies. It's a totally different animal. And then they might then give you advice based on what they know about 1900s corsets that might not be practical for a 1600s bodies. Even more important, at least for corsetry, is the person's size in relation to your own. If the expert friend you're asking is a sample size, meaning someone who, say, can fit into a red threaded pattern without any kind of adjustment to hip, bust, waist, length ratio, and you're someone like me with a wackadoodle Dolly Parton if she were a Hobbit torso, that friend might not have the experience, say, fitting a B-cup pattern onto an F-cup bust. And that happens in reverse too. You know, everybody has different fiddly things that they have to do to accommodate their individual body. That's not to diminish their knowledge or their experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the techniques are going to work on your particular body. You have to use your brain, process what they have to say, and make an adult judgment. And if their suggestion doesn't work for you, that's okay. There are many different ways to do corsetry, and there are many ways to fit corsetry. Finally, that fitting buddy can look at you in your stays and tell you, oh, it looks too long or it looks too wrinkly, etc., but they cannot tell you how it actually feels. And more than anything, physical discomfort in your fitting process is a way better indication of incorrect fit than somebody eyeballing it from a distance, or worse, a photo. That's not to say a fitting buddy is useless. We all know it's easier to have a second pair of hands, especially on your back lacing bodices. And it is good to have a second objective eye. I also find it really helpful when I'm stuck to bounce my thoughts off of another brain, or 5. But you should not be afraid to make a corset because you don't have somebody to help you. In the end, you need to make the decision yourself whether you need help or not. You need to analyze your personal situation, the help that you need, and the actual help that is available to you. This is going in niche, please. All right, that was a tangent. Let's go on to the next one. The awl. Pokey, pokey, pointy, pointy. An awl is an unassuming little tool, to be sure. But this thing is essential to creating corset stays and bodies for one simple reason. You use it to create your lacing holes. Why? Because the awl pushes through your fabric with minimal breakage, giving you the strongest, stablest holes you can possibly have, which means less chance of rips and tears and escaping grommets. If you don't already got it, get it. All right, next we've got grommet cutter. These suckers usually come with your grommet banger kits. Take the sharp edge, put it down onto your fabric, bang it with the hammer, and it cuts a nice little circle in your fabric. But guess what? We're smart. We know better. Don't cut holes in your fabric because the fabric will fray with wear, and eventually at least one of your grommet holes will stretch so big that your grommet falls out. And then you have this big honking hole in your corset. I know this from years of personal experience. This is not how we make lacing holes. You got it? Push the fabric, don't cut the fabric. This is going straight to the bottom. Nope. Next, we've got Coutil. Coutil is a tightly woven cotton fabric used for interlining. This will be one of the most expensive things that you purchase. I think the cheapest one I found is $20 a yard, not including shipping. So we're talking silk level prices here. However, if you're making a corset with steel bones, you really want to have this stuff because it's hands down the best protection from the steel. It's so sturdy, it's going to be really good for you. However, if you're working on your very first corset, you shouldn't be wasting your money on Coutil because, again, you're not going to get that much use out of it. Using a decent quality cotton canvas or a decent quality cotton duck is better for you when you're first starting out. Coutil, you're going in your third rodeo. But note that if you're doing stays or bodies, Coutil is totally optional. I usually go for a herringbone medium weight linen instead because it's half as much and way more breathable. Next, we've got the Dremel and the sanding bit. We've all seen those big name costumers with their Dremel and their synthetic whalebone. Sandy McSanderson, Sandy McSanderson. What is that? Fourth Sanderson sister? Y'all, I'm losing it. An automated sander definitely saves time, especially if you're making, say, 17th century bodies, which requires miles and miles of boning. I asked for one of the red threaded Dremel bits for Christmas, and then my dad gave me an old Dremel tool he had just laying around. So for me, the cost was $0 and it was worth it. But if you don't already have access to a Dremel, this turns into a rather hefty investment just to save a little bit of time, especially if you're not somebody who makes corsets as a job and aren't going to be doing it that often. Furthermore, it doesn't work quite as well on the plastic zip ties. I found that it does a pretty decent job on the thicker ones, but the real thin 4mm ones that you would use for 17th century bodies, it just kind of melts it and makes it sad. This is going in if you got the moolah. Next, we've got something called Plasti-dip. If you're someone who makes a lot of corsets and uses a lot of steel boning, it might be in your best interest to buy continuous steel boning and cut it yourself. You have a couple of options for tipping your boning, mainly metal tips and Plasti-dip. Metal tips are way cheaper, but Plasti-dip is readily available at most hardware stores, and it's probably a safer and more reliable option for you, as the metal tips have been known to fall off. This is also handy if you're a bustle or cage crinoline person, and probably even more useful in that situation since you will be using continuous steel boning to make those. But this is a very specific tool for a very specific use, so this is gonna go in niche please. Pre-cased boning. This is the stuff most usually found at Joann's. It's plastic boning and its own bone casing. Hey, casing, that's handy. Like Rigiline, this stuff is great for modern formal wear and gives arguably a little more structure than the Rigiline without the convenience of stitchability. I have made stays with this stuff long ago before I knew what I was doing, and it kinked so bad because it just could never. In this day and age where you can just order zip ties off of Amazon and have it delivered to you same day, you have no business using this other crap. If you do, I promise you'll regret it. This is going straight into nope. Next, we have the Grommet Press. I recently did a poll on favorite corsetry supplies, and many of you responded that the Grommet Press was your favorite. Indeed, it is handy. It takes away the need of the grommet banger thingy and allows you to lay in your grommets with just one pull of the lever. You can also get all sorts of dies for it to make it even more of a multitasker. But they are very expensive. The very cheapest ones run about $50 to $60, and I argue whether it's wise to buy the cheapest version of a tool like this. A decent one is gonna set you back at least $100. In addition, they're large, they take up a lot of space. And if you struggle with space issues like yours truly, this might not be a worthy investment. Where that changes is if you make a lot of waist reductive corsets that require metal grommets. I've not been able to justify the cost myself since my main area of focus is the 17th and to an extent the 18th centuries, where hand-worked eyelets were the norm. Maybe one day I'll change my mind, since as an apartment dweller in a very hot state, it is always really hard to motivate myself to go outside to use my grommet banger thingy so I don't disturb my neighbors. But for now, for me, the cost outweighs the convenience. This is going straight into if you got the moolah. Next up are good scissors. Having a good pair of fabric shears will change your life. Even good ones don't have to be super expensive and will make a world of a difference when trying to precisely cut out your expensive fashion fabric. If you're left-handed, I've linked to my particular pair down below since I know how hard it is to find good left-handed anything. Righties, you're on your own. You can discuss your recommendations down in the comments. Good scissors, get it. Finally, last on our list are dedicated steel boning cutters. Corsetmaking.com sells these suckers for $80 a pop. You might be tricked into thinking you need to buy an $80 pair of specialized cutters for steel boning. I almost did. I was almost that stupid. But guess what? You do not need specialized boning cutters. I use these to cut steel boning. Not just regular steel boning, hoop steel boning, which is thicker than regular steel. Guess how much these cost me at Harbor Freight Tools? $7. Don't buy unitaskers, period. Nope! Whew! We made it! I hope this list was useful for you. If I missed anything you wanted to see ranking, let me know in the comments and I'll give you a rank on the fly. If you're new to corsetry and are ready to start, you can check out this Corsetry 101 video where I talk more about supplies and prepare you to do the thing. Or if you're ready for another fun tier list, you can check out this one here on the screen. Thanks so much for making it to the end. I love y'all and I'll catch you in my next video.